This statement that we just read from Jesus in his dying moments, I'm thirsty, I thirst, maybe you know, was central to the life and mission of Mother Teresa of Calcutta, India. As most people in the world are aware, she, for decades, worked among the poorest of the poor in the city of Calcutta. And in fact, she had a famous home, a center called the Home for the Dying and the Destitute. It's in a very poor part of Calcutta, a region called Kalighat. And on the outside of the building, she has a big crucifix of Jesus above the words, I thirst. Go ahead and throw up the pic if you would, guys. So this is Mother Teresa's Home for the Dying and the Destitute in Calcutta. And yeah, there up in the top left corner is this large crucifix above the words, I thirst. And Teresa believed that Christ's thirst was about much more than just one man dehydrated from blood loss at his moment of dying. No, she saw much deeper than that. Her viewpoint was that Christ thirsts for us. Christ thirsts for humans, for their love, and Christ thirsts for the nameless, forgotten, dying, poor person. And Teresa's life mission on the streets of Calcutta was to satisfy Christ's thirst through her work. A few summers ago, I had a chance to volunteer at this Home for the Dying and the Destitute. And I experienced something that I'd like to share with you. And I think the easiest way to do it is just to read you the journal entry that I wrote later that day. But one thing by way of background information I should mention. So that summer I was traveling in Asia and I wore a necklace with a picture of St. Christopher on it. And St. Christopher is sometimes thought of as the patron saint of travelers. And the legend goes that one day Christopher carried a nameless child across a river, didn't know who the kid was, only later to find out that the child was Jesus. So Christopher means Christo, Christ, plus Pharaoh, which means to bear or to carry. So Christopher is the one who bears or carries Christ. That will become important here shortly. So this is set, it's an early morning in Calcutta, India. It's July, it's very, very hot, humid, and I'm cleaning floors and cots at the Home for the Dying and the Destitute. This is what I wrote. While I was working and thinking these thoughts, the room was empty of patients, except for one extremely ill-looking man on one of the beds. I had worked up a terrible thirst and was as wet from sweat as if I had just come out of the shower. At one point, the thirst became unbearable, but I had only 2 beds left to clean, and thinking on Teresa's emphasis on the thirst of Christ, I decided to push through and finish the beds before going to get water as an act of participating with Christ's thirst. When I was halfway through the first bed, someone started calling to me, "Brother, brother!" It was one of the Indian full-time workers. He motioned me over to him, then asked me to move the sick man to a bed across the room. So I did. I lifted him in my 2 arms and carried him across the room. And in this act, I was conscious of my determination to see Jesus in the poor. So I felt in that moment like the image of St. Christopher on my necklace, the Christ bearer. This was my Christopher moment. The man's eyes were hollowed out, his stomach sunken, his limbs as thin as humanly possible. I set him down on the new bed as gently as I could, as if setting down my Lord himself. I said a prayer, then went back to work to finish scrubbing the beds, my thirst somehow satiated. I ended up spending much of the morning with that man, helping one of the nuns clean the wounds on his foot. Well, first, actually, they asked me to change his urine-soaked pants. That was a graphic experience. When I pulled the pants down, a cluster of flies sprang into the air, and maggots fell down onto the bed. The smell was terrible. The man himself was essentially comatose, moaning in pain. His foot, in short, was rotting. The nun, who was also a nurse, wore a headlamp and pulled the dressing off his foot. More maggots. The sheer bone was exposed, along with all the layers of ligament, muscle, skin. Areas had gangrene, I think. There was no blood coming to them, and there was a large gap between the limp skin and the living tissue. She cut out the dead skin with a razor, then swabbed everything meticulously, dousing it all with hydrogen peroxide. All this time I was holding the man, pivoting his body as necessary, my hand on his shaven head or on his shoulder, and I was praying. In his conscious moments, he was craving water. I brought a cup and helped him hold it to his lips. Only with much difficulty did he get any of it down. I had to clear a maggot out of his lips first. I don't think I'll ever forget this man, and if I do, so help me God. So today we're continuing our series with you, how the gospel reshapes community and compassion. And any true understanding, theological understanding of compassion has to begin here with this boggling truth that somehow in Jesus, the God of the universe willingly became like this anonymous suffering man in India, graphically falling apart and just so terribly thirsty. How can it be that the Almighty, the great fountain of being, the spigot from whom gushes forth every beautiful thing in creation, was himself reduced to sipping sour wine from a sponge? How is that even possible? How can it be that this dying man who says, "I thirst," is himself the one to whom we can bring our own great thirsts, our own great questions and fears and doubts and disappointments, and be satisfied? How does that even work? You know, as I was caring for this sick man, the nun who I was helping asked me, and obviously it was just like a rattled American kid, like, what's going on? This is the most graphic thing I've ever physically been. And she says to me, "What do you think about when you see this man?" And I was quiet, and then I just answered with one word. I said, "Jesus." And to my great relief, she said, "That's right. We must learn to connect his suffering to our suffering and the suffering of others." See, our God is not like this heavenly CEO perched in the corner office, looking down through the glass at all the little suffering people down there saying, "Wow, sucks to be you." That's not who God is. God is the one who, before we even knew to ask, before we even knew this was possible, voluntarily gets in the elevator, so to speak, and comes down to street level, meeting the world at the point of its most acute pain and disappointment. You may recall the word compassion in English is a smush of two Latin words, cum, meaning with, and passio, passion, which comes from the term pati, which means to suffer. So compassion means to suffer with. This is not just a trite do-gooder term. It actually means that in Jesus, God suffers with, has compassion on us. The one who was himself literally the living water shows how great he is by humbling himself to say alongside me and you, "I thirst as well." And the point of our Bible study today is going to be to try to understand a little bit better what all this means. Why exactly does God have compassion on us? What does that mean? And why should his compassion orient and energize our compassion, our own attempts to be caring and loving to other people? Now, the first point I think to acknowledge here is to say right up front that Christians are by no means the only folk that are motivated to help other people. In fact, this is one of the basic premises of our series. The subtitle is How the Gospel Reshapes Community and Compassion. And this acknowledges what I think is pretty obvious, that things like community and compassion are very much secular mainstream values today as well. We encounter this all over the place. I mean, corporate boardrooms today drip with language of compassion and concern and community. Why is that? Does Christian compassion any different? If so, how? Why are our secular friends also very concerned to care for the needy? So let's explore this a little bit so that we can understand what it means to do something in the name of Jesus. There is a fascinating book by a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. The book is called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. It's a fascinating book. Haidt studies human morality, how different cultures across time and space think about good and evil. And he boils down all his findings, one way is into what he calls 6 moral foundations or taste buds of the righteous mind. And each one of these taste buds is a binary. It's like two-sided. So there's 6 of them, 6 taste buds of morality. Number 1 is care, harm. You see how it's a binary, care, harm. 2, fairness or cheating. 3, loyalty or betrayal. 4, authority or subversion. 5, sanctity, degradation. 6, liberty or oppression. Across time and culture, Haidt argues, these 6 binaries are the basis upon which humans tend to make moral decisions, except for one group of humans, which he labels with the acronym WEIRD. WEIRD. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Developed, i.e., us. In weird cultures, like ours, Haidt argues, 4 out of these 6 binaries have been removed and creating a vacuum swallowed up by just 2. 2 remain, care, harm, and liberty, oppression. But of those 2, one of them is clearly the senior partner. The real dominant one is care, harm. So this is the essence of weird ethics in our post-God modern world. We must always ask, does X action harm anybody? If so, it must be wrong. Does X action care for anybody? If so, it must be right. It's very simple. This care-harm binary seems to be the default framework from which we make decisions and really don't think about any other ethical considerations. And what matters for our study this morning is this. If we ask ourselves, why is it that our secular friends, the secular culture, mainstream culture, cares so much about compassion? I think the answer is because that's all that's left. That's the only main value left upon which we can stand. And the only main evil to remove from the world is harm. So I'll show you how this works a little bit. Just selected at random a few examples of how this plays out in our culture, our dialogue. For example, so among those caring for drug users and the homeless today, the idea of harm reduction is very much a guiding star for policy and activism. Have you heard this phrase, harm reduction? The basic notion is that, well, maybe we'll never be able to fully solve these problems, but at least we can minimize the negative consequences. At least we can reduce harm. And this strategy is very much pitched in terms of being compassionate. For example, earlier this year, the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists released a statement endorsing drug decriminalization. The idea that it shouldn't be against the law to use or possess drugs. This is what they write. This is a telling sentence. Quote, drug decriminalization would help to justify the reallocation of funding to this new public health approach by shifting resources away from law enforcement and punishment and towards more compassionate interventions. It's a compassionate intervention. My point here is not at all to weigh in on what is a controversial and very complex policy question, only to highlight how an appeal to compassion is a common thing that you encounter. Christianity does not have a monopoly here. Or how about this in a totally different arena, the armed forces? Law professor Madeline Morris writes in the Duke Law Journal that the armed forces should be animated by a, quote, vision of aggressivity with compassion. Aggressivity with compassion. I don't even know what that means. I love you. Boom. I'm not weighing in here. I'm just collecting examples of how in a weird culture like ours, compassion pops up in very unlikely places. And by the way, one thing that long-term lifer Christians often miss is that in secular culture is by no means in agreement with itself on everything. Just as within the church there can be a range of opinions on any particular matter, so in mainstream secular culture there can be a range of opinions. And this issue of how to care for other people is actually hotly contested. As an example, in 2016, Paul Bloom, a professor of psychology at Yale University, published a book called Against Empathy, Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion. Listen to how he begins this book. You know, for the last couple years, when people ask me what I've been up to, I say, I'm writing a book. Am I in heaven? Does anybody hear that music? We're there. They ask for details about my book, and I tell them it's about empathy. They tend to smile and nod when I say the word, And then I add, I'm against it. This usually gets a laugh. I was surprised at this response at first, but I've learned that being against empathy is like being against kittens, a view considered so outlandish that it can't be serious. And it's certainly a position that's easy to misunderstand. So I'll be clear from the start. I'm not against morality, compassion, kindness, love, being a good neighbor, being a mensch, and doing the right thing. Actually, I'm writing this book because I'm for all of those things. I want to make the world a better place. I've just come to believe that relying on empathy is the wrong way to do it. And so his basic argument is to say that, look, if our code of conduct is only steered by empathy, we're going to end up hurting the very people we're trying to help. It doesn't work. And so these are just a few examples of how compassion and its associated terms, as the New York Times puts it in its review of Bloom's book, is, quote, one of our culture's most ubiquitous sacred cows. Compassion is a sacred cow. Don't touch it. It is holy. What should Christians think about this sacred cow? And we all know irreligious people who are very nice and generous and seem very kind. Are they wrong? Is an act of love an act of love and it really doesn't matter what motivates it? Or is there really still a difference? I actually think this issue of motivation is where the rub is found. So, one of the consequences of living in a post-God, post-truth world is that the only ground for authority has to be found in the self. If I ask, why should I do such and such? I can't point to any source out there that says how I should live, some king, some law. No, that's what's called a social construction. That's coercive. No, I need to find my authorization within. There is no shared external standard that we can all appeal to. Morality has to be self-authorizing, come from within. Something is only right or wrong because I feel that it is right or wrong. And if society disagrees with me, well, so much the worse for society. My authority is my own authenticity. That's how it's structured. And this leads some people to do compassionate deeds, no doubt. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But there are a couple drawbacks to this reliance on subjective feelings. First off, it's totally arbitrary. It's totally arbitrary. The whole framework is, look, if compassion does it for you, then go for it, man. But it has nothing to do with like the way the world is. It has nothing to do with the nature of reality. It's just a preference. And then related to that, secondly, without a shared norm, my feelings can ever only guide me, not you. My moral compass can never tell you what you should do. It can only tell you what you could do, if you like. But it can't tell you what you should do, whether or not you like. You see the difference? Christianity, by contrast, is different because the motivation is not found in us. It is found in God. Why should we work to alleviate suffering and poverty and injustice and all the rest? And we should. Why? Because God has initiated by first radically loving us, meeting us in our poverty and brokenness and suffering. And so we are just passing it on to others. In the Christian viewpoint, God's love is like the engine deep within reality. It's what causes everything to hang together and to go. As a designer might say, it is not bolted on, it's built in. It's not part of the design, it is the design. And because of this, something really important happens. Something vital happens. God's love shifts not only our big motivation, our big why, it also shifts our attitude, our how we go about doing stuff. How so? Well, God's love humbles us. God's love humbles us. It tells us that actually what we really are is loved sinners. We're a bunch of screw-ups and rebels to whom God has been very kind. Love undercuts ego. It undercuts ego so that my generosity to you is not based on my own superiority because I'm just such a good guy. No, it's actually based in having been shown my own lack. You see how this turns everything around? We don't help others because we're strong. We help them because we're weak, too. In myself, I don't have the resources to heal anybody, much less myself, but that's okay because Christian compassion is not fundamentally about what I can offer. It is not a paternalistic handout. It is fraternal solidarity. It says, man, you need some love and grace in your life. And you know what? So do I, brother. So do I. So let's try to sum up what we've been saying these last couple minutes this way. Let's take it nice and slow. Go ahead and throw it up, guys, if you would. God's love in Jesus shifts compassion from could, if you feel like it, to should, because this is the way reality is. And compels change, not only in the brokenness of the world, as indeed it does, but also in our own hearts. We love others not from a position of self-satisfied strength. Oh, I'm just so rich and strong, I should just dole out some philanthropy. We don't love from that position. We actually love from a position of shared weakness. This is how the gospel reshapes compassion. It's not about us at all. It's actually about Jesus. Christians are people who have been intercepted at the point of our weakness by a compassionate God, and now we find ourselves loved into loving a very thirsty world. Does that make sense? Now, that all might sound nice, but there is one still little wrinkle that we need to iron out, which is this. We can't do it. What I've just been describing, sure, maybe that's what we should do, but it is mighty hard to do with any consistency. It's an ideal that is rarely materialized regularly in my life anyways. Why is that? Why do we struggle to truly live lives of love and compassion? At bottom, I think the issue here is a malfunction of love. It is a malfunction of love. For example, here at the Bay Church, our core mission, what we're all about, is expressed in these words: loving God and loving people. That's what we want to do, love God and love people. But there's a third love that's in the mix, and it's very seductive, and it's very strong. You know what it is? Loving self. Loving self. Loving things that please self, that bring advantage to self. If I'm ever moved to compassion and feel sorry for somebody, you know who it's usually for? Me. I feel sorry for myself. I'll give you an example, and this is a long story. I told the story much longer a few weeks ago in Concord. But a few years ago, there was a time when I was realizing, just having to confront that, man, I actually do struggle with OCD and intrusive thoughts. And this is going to take a long time to get a hold of. This is not a quick fix. And you know what my response was? Self-pity. I feel very sorry for myself. Poor me. It's hard to be me. And that attitude must have been very obvious, because the Christian therapist I was seeing at the time, in our very first meeting, he said to me, "Ryan, I have some homework for you." I said, "Yeah, what's that?" He said, "I want you to do something for somebody who cannot possibly pay you back." I was like, huh? What kind of homework is that? I thought I was in therapy. It was a jolt to my system. He was trying to shake me out of my self-pity and get me to open my eyes to other people and their problems. Do something for somebody who cannot possibly pay you back. There's nothing in it for you. This reminds me actually of something Jesus said. So Jesus was at a party, not uncommon for him. And he said something that offended his host, also not uncommon for him. He was a straight talker. This is what Jesus says in Luke 14. He said to the man who had invited him, "Hey, when you give a dinner or a banquet, like the one we're at right now, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives, like the people sitting all around us, or your rich neighbors. Why? Well, lest they also invite you and return, and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed." Why will you be blessed? Because they can't repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Now, what does this little teaching turn on? It turns on whether or not we do something so that others can repay us. How often is that part of our calculation? Pretty often, I think, if we're honest, we slip into a transactional mindset and are calculating, well, what's in it for me? Where's the kickback here? But you may be thinking, what? So Jesus is saying I shouldn't love my family and friends? Or I should prevent them from loving me in return? Is that what Jesus is getting at? No, that's not what Jesus is getting at. What he's trying to get us to see, I think, and using his usual shock therapy of a provocative statement, is that there is a totally different way to go about relationships. Theologians often talk about two different aspects of love, trying to understand love and all of its multifacetedness. And two aspects that are strongly contrasted with each other are these: eros, which is a very human type of love that ascends to beautiful things, and agape, which is God's love, which descends to broken things. There's a love that ascends to the beautiful. There's a love that descends to the broken. And let me just say, there's nothing wrong with beautiful, good things. God creates a good world and says, it is very good. There's nothing wrong with eros, with pleasure. But this good world is also bent through rebellion against God. And you know what? God still loves it anyways. God's love stoops down to what is stubborn, what is cracked, what is ugly, what is tossed onto the junk heap. He doesn't love things because they're already lovely or because they're already lovable. That's what eros does. It sees the lovely and is attracted. God's love, agape love by contrast, pursues what is unattractive, what is repulsive, what is scrapped, and makes it lovely, makes it lovable. You see the difference? So for us today, I think the key is this, what Jesus is getting at in Luke 14. For you and me, learning to love with God's downward agape love heals our own disordered self-love. Learning to love with God's downward agape love heals our own disordered self-love. And just to be clear, we are indeed talking about a downward God, not downward dog. That's a yoga pose. We are talking about a downward God and why it's vital that we learn to love like him. You see, we need a way out of the prison of our own inward-looking self, stuck in our cell block, worshiping the man or woman in the mirror. We need a jailbreak, and Jesus shows us the jailbreak. I love how the German theologian Joseph Ratzinger puts this. He was later elected as Pope Benedict XVI. He writes this: love is indeed ecstasy. Ecstasy comes from ek, out of, stasis, standing. Ecstasy means standing outside of yourself. Love is indeed ecstasy, not in the sense of a moment of intoxication, but rather as a journey, an ongoing exodus out of the closed, inward-looking self toward its liberation through self-giving, and thus towards authentic self-discovery and indeed the discovery of God. Love is a jailbreak, an exodus out of our own worship of self that actually is like a therapy. And you know what's the purpose of that therapy and what freedom actually looks like? Is when our whole mindset shifts from getting to giving. That's the therapy, and love is that ecstasy. So if you want to find yourself, become your truest, best, realized self, you want to find God, you know what the secret is? You have to do what God is. Love. You have to do what God is. That's the real ecstasy to which we're called. And let's return one more time to Jesus' teaching here in Luke. Because did you notice what he said there at the end? After he tells us not to seek repayment. This is what he says: for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So he isn't telling us not to seek repayment. In fact, he is urging us to seek repayment, just in the right currency, in resurrection currency. These next couple moments are really important for understanding what we're getting at today, so hang with me. To review, when God came into the world, to his good but bent world, he's going to save it from himself. That mission led him to the cross. It led him to the horror of Golgotha. Asphyxiating, dehydrating, screaming, maybe only moaning, I am thirsty. He has compassion with us. He suffers with us. We've talked about this. But here's what's utterly vital. If we miss the next bit, we miss the crunch of the whole good news that set the world on fire. The cross wasn't the end. It wasn't the end. Horror wasn't the end. Brokenness and evil did their worst, but they didn't have the last word. Had they had the last word, we never even would have heard of Jesus. He'd have been just another dreamer. He'd have been just another poet bulldozed by history. But that's not what happened. God, yes, meets the world in its trauma, but he has zero intention to leave it there. That's not the end point. From ancient times, throughout the scriptures, Israel's prophets whispered rumors that God's plan was to heal the world, and not just a little patch-up job, not just a quick fix, a thoroughgoing, radical healing, a new heavens and a new earth, perfectly in harmony with each other, God's love intermingling forever, joyously, with his human creatures. And this was never, ever abstract religious poetry, pie in the sky. No, this was a very material, earthy promise. God is going to fix the world and live with his people. And then on Easter, instantly, shockingly, that promise began to materialize in the body of Jesus. His resurrection, real flesh, mutilated flesh, was healed and transformed, becoming the tip of the spear of new creation. The promise that God intends to fully complete in the fullness of time. And this is where everything comes crashing home to me and you today. This is where the rubber meets the road for us. Jesus urges us to seek resurrection currency, to seek the new creation that has been jump-started in his own body. One day, if we remain faithful, this will include resurrection bodies for us as well. That's the Bible. Bodily resurrection is central to the gospel, but that's in the future. And Jesus has told us how to get there. That's the game plan of the cross, self-sacrificial love. But what do we do today while we're waiting? What's the point? This is the point. This is the point. When we show compassion like Jesus, pursuing the good of those who are hurting, lost, rejected, we are helping God bring new creation to birth today. Compassion helps God bring new creation to birth today. Easter means that God's promise is already starting to be fulfilled. And so when we do work in Jesus' name, when we're empowered and led by his Spirit, resurrection life cannot help but spring up all over. So in the end analysis, this is what Christian compassion is all about. It's not about do-gooding and philanthropy and harm reduction, as good as some of those things may be. It is about new creation. New creation, as Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, when a man or woman is in Christ, boom, new creation. He or she is a new creation. The old is gone. The new has come. And when I hear these words, I got to ask myself, has this happened to me? I got to ask you, has that happened to you? Have you accepted God's compassion in your life? If not, why not? Isn't it about time? And if so, what are you doing with it? Are you sharing that compassion with others? That's the next step. So let me speak practically here for just a minute. Here in our greater region, there are many beautiful churches doing a lot of good work for those in need, and we applaud them. At our church, we focus on 4 main pathways: foster care, food security, homeless care, and school support. You can learn all about these afterwards, just right out here. Also on our website, we have a whole page. In your app notes, I've included the link so you can learn about it on the website there. But we need to ask ourselves questions like these. How can we be Jesus to a child who needs stability? A child who has 0 stability in their life, how can we be Jesus to them? How can we be Jesus to a homeless veteran who needs clean clothes and a shower? Just someone to talk to. How can we be Jesus to immigrant families who are living on food stamps and just need basic groceries? How can we be Jesus to an elementary school teacher who's at the end of her rope and feels utterly unsupported? How can we be Jesus to a little boy struggling to learn his ABCs, who just needs a tutor and a friend? Guys, we don't have to go to Calcutta, India to find tear-filled eyes in whom we can see the reflection of Jesus himself. They're all around us. And woe to us if we don't help our Lord Our compassion ministry team here at the church, I'm so proud to know these people. They do excellent work. We're not about just like random acts of kindness. No, we've actually got a plan. We have a system. We have a team. And if you're interested in getting part of that and being a vehicle for God's love, we have an informational meeting coming up, not this Tuesday, but next Tuesday night in the Concord campus. This is the 13th at 6:30 p.m. in the 220s. There will be an informational meeting with our compassion team. It'll be actually during our deeper class hour, learning about how to get involved, how to participate. So let me close then today with a prayer that I ran across the other day. This is called a prayer for changing diapers. It's beautiful, I think, because in Hebrew, the word for compassion is rachamim, which is related to the word rechem, which means womb, like a woman's womb. This suggests then compassion is not some sort of exotic, high-flying thing. No, it's actually deeply practical and parental sort of love. Compassion is related to a parent's love for their child. So listen to this prayer for changing diapers. Heavenly Father, in such menial moments as this, the changing of a diaper, I would remember this truth. My unseen labors are not lost, for it is these repeated acts of small sacrifice that, like bright, ragged patches, are slowly being sewn into a quilt of loving kindness that swaddles this child. I'm not just changing a diaper. By love and service, I am tending a budding heart that, rooted early in such grace-filled devotion, might one day be more readily inclined to bow to what? To your compassion, to your compassionate conviction, knowing itself then as both a receptacle and a reservoir of heavenly grace. So this little act of diapering, though in its form sometimes felt as base drudgery, might be better described as one of 10,000 acts by which I am actively creating what? A culture of compassionate service and selfless love to shape the life of this family and this beloved child. So take this unremarkable act of necessary service, O Christ, and in your economy, let it be multiplied into that greater outworking of worship and of faith, a true investment in the incremental advance of your kingdom across generations. Open my eyes that I might see this act for what it is from the fixed vantage of eternity, O Lord, how the changing of a diaper might sit upstream from the changing of a heart, how the changing of a heart might sit upstream of the changing of the world. Amen. Now I know what some of you are thinking, hey, changing diapers isn't just for moms. Well, did you hear about the baseball player whose wife asked him one evening and said, hey, will you change the baby, please? And he said to her, listen, honey, I'm a ball player. This isn't really my line of work. And she'd heard this before, so she looked him straight in the eye and said, listen, Buster, you lay the diaper out like a ball diamond. You put the baby's bottom right there on the pitcher's mound. Then you connect up home plate and second base. You bring first base and third base together, and if it starts to rain, the game ain't over. You get to start all over again. God bless you. Have a great week.
Oh, thank you, Pastor Ryan. Now give it up for him one more time. Really appreciate having the opportunity to hear from a wide variety of teachers here at the Bay Church. Hey, just wanted to pass on to you a few things that are happening here over the next few weeks. On September 17th, for all of the gentlemen in the room, there will be a men's breakfast. The cost to get in is $12. There's also some cheaper things to do if you want to get a whole table, or for any of our senior gentlemen in the room. Our speaker for that is going to be Darwin Benjamin, really incredible man of God who does ministry in the local area here. But gentlemen, head on over to that. It's going to be great. The food's always great, and the speaking and the communion is also fantastic. Secondly, we have an incredible compassion ministry that we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks, and we would love for you to find a place to get involved. There's a lot of serving opportunities, so stop out on the table that's right out these doors as you head out after service today, and just ask them about the right spot for you. There's a place in the book of Matthew, chapter 23, where Jesus is talking to some of the religious people of his day, and this is something that he says to them. He says, all of you religious people are so careful to give to God from even the tiniest income you make from selling herbs from your garden. And it's a good thing to give to God. But this is what he says to them. You miss the more important aspects of the law, things like justice, mercy, and faith. So my encouragement to each and every one of us would be, don't neglect the giving to God, but find those places where God can use us to compassionately serve the people that he's put in our midst, to bring justice, mercy, faith, and compassion to our community. So would you please today stop by and find the right place where you can serve to get involved. But these things also don't happen unless we give. That's why Jesus ends by saying, don't neglect the former things, but also do the latter as well. So if you'd like to give to support the ministries of the Bay Church, this is money that goes to allowing us to have a shower trailer that goes around the East Bay every week, multiple days a week. This allows us to have a compassion food bank where every Saturday people can come through and shop for food that is free to them and have the opportunity to get food for their family. If you'd like to do that today, you can give in person here at the back of the room. There's a black box on the wall. There's also one as you walk out these doors today. You can also give online at thebay.church/give. And finally, you can text the number that's on the screen behind me. Also wanted to mention, if you are new with us here at the Bay Church, maybe you've been here for a while, but you're wondering how you can get more connected and involved, we have something here called Growth Track. It's just the next step that you can take to find your place here at the Bay Church, and more importantly, to find your place in the kingdom of God. Would love to have you follow through on Growth Track. You can do that by texting the number that's right here on the screen, 77411, and what you'll text is just the word Growth Track, all one word. Finally, if you need prayer today or throughout the week, you can just come up right after service. Pastor Ryan, myself will be right here to pray with you if you have any needs. But you can also text the number that's right here on the screen. This is our prayer line, and a member of our prayer team will reach out to you so that they can kind of walk alongside of you as you go through whatever you're going through this week. With that said, friends, thank you so much for being here, and have a great rest of your week.